Our lecturer tonight is Bruce Twickler. He's the writer and director of the documentary film Damrell's Fire. He's been a resident of Boston for 30 years. He was an MIT grad in electrical engineering, worked for 15 years in consumer electronics, and then 15 years in the software business. In recent years, he's been involved in a 3D software project, which has resulted in some of the work he's going to talk to us about tonight. And the title of his lecture is Damrell and the Great Boston Fire of 1872. Please welcome Bruce Twickler.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. And as you've just heard, I'm Bruce Twickler, and I'm the writer and director of Damrell's Fire, which is a story about a fire chief and a fire. And people always ask, well, what brought you to make a movie about this particular fire? Well, one of the reasons was, the major reason is about 3 years ago, I didn't even know that there was a great fire in Boston. I thought that I knew a little bit about the history of Boston, but I just had never heard of it before in the 30 years that I've been here. And I began to ask around, and it turned out that my friends and even natives of Boston didn't know anything about the Boston Fire either. And so that was interesting, just that part that no one had ever heard anything. So as a subject for a movie, needless to say, there was something new and that hadn't been overworn. The second thing that began to emerge after we began investigating is that this movie had a lot of interesting, the actual historical event, it's not a movie yet, the actual historical event had a lot of interesting facets, not the least of which were the characters involved. Damrell himself, which we'll talk about quite a bit today, but also Nathaniel Bradley, who was a famous architect here in Boston, and also the president of the water board that turned out to be Damrell's nemesis as the fire chief. And also a fellow named William Burt, he went by the title of General William Burt, although he was never actually in the Army. But no one ever questioned him when he walked into a room and talked that he was in charge. And there was one other emerging character that happened along, and that was Boston itself, the city of Boston. And so those combination of those characters, and just the discovery that not only was this a big fire by regional standards, but even by national standards. Oops. So this is one of the things, this happens to me all the time, and I don't know whether it happens to you, but you ignore things for things that you don't know about, but then when you actually begin thinking about them and begin paying attention, you see them everywhere. Well, this appeared about 6 months after we began the project in Newsweek, and I had never picked up on the Boston 1872 being the 5th largest fire ever in the United States in terms of destructive damage, dollars damage. So San Francisco was off the charts. Chicago was next. There's two woodlands fires in Southern California and Northern California, and then the Boston Fire, which has $1.1 billion here in 2003, and there's other estimates that go up to $1.5 billion damage. So it was a very destructive fire. But I would just like to ask, how many people here had heard something about the fire, say, before 2 or 3 years ago? So it's about 50%. Well, this is a very good group. I can see that. I don't know whether you'll be able to learn anything tonight. But anyway, so you do know about the Boston Fire, but about 50% didn't, and that's interesting, given the fact that it was such a huge catastrophe for the city. And we'll talk a little bit as we go along about why this particular fire isn't known like the Chicago fire and the San Francisco. I mean, it may be just bad marketing on the part of Boston and not marketing its disasters properly. But we've done a good job with the molasses. Everybody knows about the molasses spill. So I think that's one of the more interesting facets of this event. So one of the other things, as I said, that Boston itself was a character, and we felt that we could add something to that, to the story, the narrative, making it a little more compelling and dramatic by actually translating some of the early photography into computer 3D models. And at the end of the presentation here, we'll play a 5-minute reel that incorporates some of that animation in there. But in order to do that, we actually reproduced from photographs or sometimes actual architectural drawings themselves the actual city of Boston. That's what Boston looked like in 1872. And we can actually go and walk down those streets, the same streets as though you were there in 1872. So that's very exciting, and needless to say, that adds another dimension for the movie. So So one of the things about our movie, what the premise of our movie is, as you saw, is that this is how one firefighter stopped America's cities from burning down. And I think the first thing I want to point out is that the America's cities in the 19th century were burning down. They were burning down a lot. I listed for 25 years the major fires, the fires that had substantial damage, on average 600 or 700 buildings burned down. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but this is the one I could fit into this slide. And as you can see, they were all over the country. This is just the 19th century between 1835 and 1860, hopefully you can see that. Beginning with New York with 655, and then all the way to the tenements and San Francisco. This is a very interesting period right here. This is the gold rush in San Francisco. And San Francisco burned down so many times in 1849, 1850, and 1851 that you had trouble, actually reading about, you had trouble keeping track of them. And one of the reasons was on May 3rd in 1850, the city burned down. And if you read the historical accounts, you see, well, the city in 1851 on May 3rd burned down. You said, well, these guys, they should get their story straight. Well, it turned out it burned down on May 3rd in 1850 and on May 3rd, 1851 both. And they kept burning it down and rebuilding it. As a matter of fact, the only reason, these two fires right here were only a month apart. And the only reason there wasn't a lot more damage in this one is that they could only build 500 buildings in a month. These mass fires, these conflagrations, it's almost like it is sort of sounds like a 19th century word, conflagrations, were affecting America's cities, and it didn't get any better after the Civil War, and we'll go on a little bit about that. But it was almost like the progress of the country was going to be interrupted by these major fires. And as you can see, some of them were huge, 2,000 buildings, 600 buildings. So what we will talk about is how Damrell, John S. Damrell, stopped America's cities from burning down. And in order for that to happen, of course, it's more than one person and more than one set of circumstances. And I think that the important thing to realize, and sort of one of the sub-theses of this talk, is that in order to stop, to go from the 19th century to the 20th century, and by the 1920s the city stopped burning down, there was a lot of technology, and there's a lot of training, a lot of techniques that had to be learned and applied. And there had to be some good ideas applied, simple ideas like more water, and some pretty sophisticated ideas like the telegraph alarm system. But one of the things that Damrell was crucial in influencing and making happen is that the thing that had to happen to keep cities from burning down is to build them so that they would not burn down. And in order for that to happen, many things had to happen. You had to have city governments, mayors, legislatures pass laws that said you couldn't build certain kinds of buildings in certain places. In other words, it was a political action. It was an act of political will. So there's politics entwined entwined in the entire process of going from where we were in 1860 to 1880 and 1890 into the 1920s. And once again, Damrell was right there. He was right there in the legislatures. He was right there in feeding fire chiefs around the country, his legislative programs and his codes. And we'll get to that a little later. But the key is that it's an act of political will to stop cities from burning down, as it is any specific technique or technology. So what I would like to do in terms of the outline of the program tonight, I'd like to sort of track Boston and Damrell, first of all, as they sort of come of age in the between 1828 and 1860, and just track it track the city in as much as it was related to the fire department, and track Damrell and his career as a fireman. So in 1828, Josiah Quincy, who was that right there, was the second mayor of Boston, and he is very famous, of course, for Quincy Market. And he was not elected or he was not reelected in 1828. And the reason he wasn't reelected in 1828 is very interesting, is because he had reorganized the fire department. And the fire department then, and as all through the next 20 or 30 years, was very, very politically active. And essentially, he essentially ascribed his loss in the mayoral election of 1828 to his enemies that he made on the fire department. And so that's one facet of this Boston, which was a town and was becoming a city. And how it became a city, and this is also crucial to our story, because I'll keep talking about how they went as far as they could with the organization of the fire department, and they had to go to the state legislature to get the charter redone so that they could actually reorganize the fire department. And that's exactly what they did. That's exactly what Josiah Quincy did in 1826. And what was happening there is that even Boston itself in 1822 became a city. Well, what did that mean? Before 1822, it was a town. The only thing that was authorized in the Massachusetts Constitution was a town with its typical town meeting. Well, Boston was already about 43,000 people. It was becoming very cumbersome, and it was very clear that they needed a new organization. So they petitioned the state legislature, and the state legislature put a referendum in, and the voters of Boston voted to have a city-type government with a mayor and aldermen and a common council. But it didn't pass by a wild majority. It passed by 500 votes. It was a very narrow majority because people didn't trust putting power in the hands of a few people. And that's key to understanding everything that we'll be talking about the political scene tonight, is that people just didn't trust putting power in people's hands, in a few people's hands. And so it was mistrust. And one of the ironies of it all is the leader of the movement against going to city government from a town government was actually Josiah Quincy. But he seemed to adapt quickly, quite rapidly after that, to the new circumstances. But what becoming a city was essentially they were inventing a city. So there was no cities in Massachusetts. So they put together a charter, and it worked okay, but they always had to go back for new revisions to the charter because they couldn't anticipate what would work and what wouldn't work. And believe me, the setup that they had going from their town government to city government was one that would be a miracle if it worked. It was 8 aldermen with a mayor. The mayor had no executive power whatsoever. He was sort of the chairman of the board of the aldermen and broke ties. Then there was a common council that had four representatives from each of the 12 wards, so it was 48, and they would have to vote on everything of importance in concurrent sessions. So each body had sort of a veto over the other. It was sort of the balance of powers thing taken to its logical extreme. And so that was what came in. And of course, Josiah Quincy's famous innovation is he became the head of every committee and drove through all his programs, one of which was health reform. He cleaned up the streets. He reformed the police department. Actually, he built the police department, and then he reformed reorganized the fire department, and was held in some disrepute. And so the people that were resisting him on the fire department were the fire wards, and not the fire wards so much, but people who worked for the fire wards. And what they were in opposition, where the conflict came, was that there was an innovation that was they put a hose to where the source of supply was, and took that hose to the engine, and then they pumped the engine, then pumped in, put out the flames. Well, before that time, they had bucket brigades. So everybody would come down with their buckets, and people would get in the line. As a matter of fact, the fire wards in there had the right to demand that you get in line with your bucket and pass the buckets up and down. And if you didn't, do what he said, you'd fine $10. And people just pointed out that a lot of buildings could be burned down, and no one's going to remember who didn't get in line, and so they had to have a different system. But even when it was so clear that one needed a different system, there was still resistance, and the charter amendment to get the new fire department also only passed by about 500 votes. But anyway, I thought it was worth spending some time on this because, as you'll see, there's an intimate relationship and an intricate relationship between the fire department in the 19th century and how it was operated, and essentially the state government and the city government. And not only did they have the aldermen and the common councils, there were three major boards that weren't even part of the city government. The fire wards were not under the control of city government. The House of Industry, the poorhouse, and the schools were not in charge. So they had all this distribution of power because there was so much mistrust. So, let's see if we can go. So this is going to be a very difficult slide for people to see in the back or the front. As a matter of fact, I can't make it out myself. But in any case, this is John Damrell, our hero, was born right here. And if you can see these little dots, those are little dots of cholera outbreaks. And this is a map of 1849. But the same could be said of this is the North End right here. There's the Common. This is the North End. The same could be said of John Damrell's time. So he was born in 1828. His father was a Mason. And they lived in the North End there for a few years, moved to Cambridge. When they moved to Cambridge, John's mother died. He was 7 years old. And then his baby sister died before that, all from typhus. Then his father, approximately 5 years later, also died. His father died a slow death, or a lingering death, and had enough time to put him in the hands of a guardian. And that guardian then sent him to school, and when he was 14 years old, apprenticed him to a house builder, a home builder in Cambridge. And that's where he learned his trade of being a master carpenter. And it was a very fortunate circumstance for Damrell to be part of this person's business, because this is the kind of business that he ended up being very successful in himself later on, and the kinds of homes he built. This is, oops. There, oops. There it is. That's good. That's Isaac Melvin's house. And we are almost certain that this is one of the homes, because of the time and because it was done during Damrell's apprenticeship, that this is one of the houses that Damrell actually worked on. And it's in Cambridge, and as you can see, it's a pretty good house. And so when he returned to Boston after his 4-year apprenticeship when he was 18, he knew not only, he sort of had a combination of carpenter's training, but also business school, sort of his business school training as well. And that would become his profession as time went on. So when he returned into the Boston in the 1840s, it was 1846, I'm sure most of you are familiar with sort of the state of the volunteer companies, but the volunteer companies were actually competitive, the volunteer fire companies, and they would compete to get first water. The insurance companies would pay not only a few dollars to each person for getting first water, but also hogsheads of beer, so that's 63 gallons, according to reliable estimates. And so they got money and beer for getting first water, so that was very competitive. And there was many instances, and anybody that saw the gangs of New York could see this in graphic detail, of fire companies. And this is not only in Boston, it was in Cincinnati, it was in New York. The fire companies would get to the scene of a fire, they would have a big fight to see who would get the rights to first water, and the building would burn down while they were fighting. And this happened everywhere, and sooner or later, but the story of Boston, the one I like in Boston is that they were, when they switched over after Josiah Quincy's reform, they went into a system of chief engineer and assistant engineers. But then the assistant engineers didn't have direct control over the volunteer companies because they had their own foreman and assistant foreman, so they were sort of entities unto themselves. So there was a fire in Roxbury, and there was engine company engine company number 8 was going full tilt down to Roxbury. They weren't in Roxbury themselves, but they thought they'd help out. And Assistant Engineer Green stopped them and said, "That's okay. That fire is covered. Go back. It'll just cause commotion if you guys show up." And so they had a vote. So the foreman took a vote of the fire company there of how many people wanted to go back and how many people wanted to go to the fire. Well, everybody voted to go to the fire, so they kept on going. So there was another assistant engineer about a mile down the road, and he said, "Well, wait a minute, you guys, you're supposed to stop. You're supposed to go back." And so they paused. They had another vote, and that vote was a very similar one to the first one. They voted to go, and they went down and participated in putting out the fire. Well, that engine company was disbanded because of this gross insubordination. But that's the kind of thing that would happen, even when they weren't competing and getting into fistfights with each other. They would actually there would be some non-optimum fire coverage going on. So this was sort of the reason I mentioned this about, and this is happening, that incident in Roxbury happened in 1845. In 1846, John Damrell actually joined the force. And so he joined the force. He was with a few companies. And then he joined Cataract Engine number 4. And it was down at the foot of Mount Vernon. And his career sort of took off. One of the things that you can get a sort of an inkling what kind of person that Damrell was, both in his professional life and his civic life. He was in town for about 3 months when he came over from his apprenticeship, and had become foreman of a building project for D.P. Gross, who was a builder in Boston. And that same kind of, you can sort of see this person coming from a distance, because he gets with the Cataract Engine number 4, and the second year he's a foreman of the hose company. Then he's clerk the next year. Then he's assistant foreman of the engine company the next year. Then 4 years later, after just being with the company for 5 years, he was elected foreman of the company. So these people, and these were his own peers that were electing him. So it was more than just someone in the administration of city government that said, well, this guy might have something. It was his own peers that felt that they wanted him to lead them to fight fires. So that's our first inkling of what happened. We can only call a meteoric career in his first continuous fire service. And then came along, so that was 1856, he was a foreman. In 1857, and this is something that is quite remarkable, and we don't have the complete explanations even though we've been studying it, is he was elected to city council. But this is a very important facet, an important point to remember, is because John Damrell was always connected at City Hall. And when he had difficulty at City Hall, it wasn't because he wasn't connected. He was maybe connected to the people that weren't in power at that time. So he was a city councilman. He made a lot of connections while he was at City Council. And the next year then he was elected, when he went back into the fire service, he was elected an assistant engineer. So he was captain of the Boston Fire Department. He was 28 years old. He had started his own business by that time. And what was happening to the Boston Fire Department is that they were becoming more professional. And I have to tell one Barnacote anecdote. So not only were the firefighters themselves sort of a little wild, but there was a chief engineer called Barnacote that was also was at the end of the non-professional range, the non-professional time. The next guys that came in were pretty professional and settled things down. But he was looking at they were worried about this new engine and hose combination that couldn't reach up to like the 4th or 5th floor in these new high buildings. And so his assistant said, what are we going to do? You can't, should we even bother with these engines? Because, we can pump all we want, but we can't reach those top floors. And he said, don't worry, it'll burn down. And you can reach it then. They'll be able to reach it after it burns down. So it was this kind of advanced firefighting thinking that pervaded the 1840s to the 1850s, but then the chief engineer by the name of George Bird came in, and he was sort of Damrell's mentor as far as being the chief engineer, and he essentially ushered in the era of the steam engine. And Damrell then, as an assistant engineer, was there at the beginning of the transformation of the department from a large number of volunteers with hand engines to technically sophisticated and very highly organized steam engine companies that had engineers, had foremen, that had a lot of technical support that was necessary, and also, of course, it was a much better firefighting system. And so he was there at that. He was there at that time. He ushered that in. So it's sort of interesting because Damrell was always thought of as being such a modern fire chief, but he was part of the fire department when in the 1840s, when things were wild, in the 1850s when the steam engines came in, and he essentially, along with the other assistant engineers, brought this technology into firefighting. So this is a little snapshot. I haven't talked much about his family. This is one of those hard-working slides too. I'm sure you can see the handwriting, but it's the census from 1860, and it's sort of an interesting thing for an interesting document for a number of reasons. But in 1850, John Damrell married Susan Hill, and they had 5 children. They had 2 daughters who died before the census, that were born between 1850 and 1860, who died before the census. But they had 3 surviving children as of the 1860 census, whose names were John, Carrie, and Charles, and they had a servant whose name was Elizabeth Sweeney. So they had a servant. His net worth is right here, because you were assessed on your real property and also your personal property for taxes, and to even have an entry here puts you in the top 10%, because there's very few people in these census forms, as you look through them, that have any entries here at all. So he was already starting his upper middle class climb, even from the beginning, and he had a net worth at that time between he and his wife, and that's also something we have not figured out, of $13,000. So if you do the math, so the conversion that I use between 19th century and today is about $20 in today's money. So that's about $260,000, $250,000 of net worth. So he wasn't doing too bad for being in town 15 years and participating in on the fire department. And so he had learned his lessons from Isaac Melvin very well. He was a very sought-out builder. And he continued that business because as an assistant engineer's job was not a full-time job at that time. But in any case, so he continued to have tragedy in his personal life, in his entire life. He lost his mother, he lost his sister, he lost his father, he lost 2 daughters, and although this wasn't that unusual, it still was something that when we do our own amateur psychoanalysis of it, you must think that he was thinking, well, maybe one of the things that drove him, because he was driven to stop fires and to save lives, was the fact that this was one area that he could do it, whereas he couldn't save his own family from the typhus and cholera and the other epidemics that were raging through the 19th century. But it's something that's certainly from the kind of passion that he brought to firefighting is certainly as plausible as any other explanation for his drive and determination. So in 1866, Damrell was elected, and this time not by the men but by the city council. He was elected to be the chief engineer. So this is him right here, and those are the other department heads of the city sitting there looking at you, and it looks like a pretty formidable group. And so Damrell is a chief engineer. Damrell, as a chief engineer, began to take a broad view of firefighting, and he was thinking very deeply about why were these cities burning down. In the year, for example, that he became the chief engineer, Portland burned down. There was 1,000 buildings in Portland. So that map that I showed you was not the map for the entire 19th century. It was just the map for those 25 years. But even after the Civil War, buildings, the cities were burning down, even more so, and even with more violent and much greater frequency. And so Portland was the first one, even in the year that he was there. So he was looking for solutions to that. And the solutions that he came on, of course, one was water supply, and the other one was the building. And so he actually began a campaign, even as this is long before his other campaigns, when he actually his campaigns became a crusade later on. He began a campaign that resulted in 5 years in the first building code for the city of Boston that required an inspector to inspect buildings. Now, the inspector didn't have a lot of power, and in some ways he couldn't force people to do things that they didn't want to do, but at least it was the beginning. And he did that even while he was the chief engineer. The other thing he needed was water, and more water. He started complaining about the water supply in the downtown district. And what had happened is, like on Summer Street and in Franklin and Devonshire, you used to have homes like this, 2 or 3 stories high. This is Daniel Webster's home. And this is what it turned into. It turned into block-long warehouse store, warehouse offices. There's the picture. There's a statue of Daniel Webster right there. This building, as it turns out, would not long survive. But this is what every street and every block looked like, and had replaced these very nice 2 or 3 story homes. And so the water supply was completely inadequate to that, and Damrell began to complain about it right in his first report, his first annual report. He complained there's not enough water. And you would think, there's sort of common sense that people would agree that they should get more water in there, but common sense was beside the point, really. So Nathaniel Bradley was the president of the Water Board in 1868, 69, and 70. He was a member of the Water Board before that and after. And he had a different point of view. His view was, sort of like Barnicoat's in a way, is that the water supply was good enough and that the city would not be justified in tearing up the pipes and putting them back down. It cost $6 million or $300 million in our terms to relay the pipes when they had all these new areas in the South End and in Back Bay that they had, and bringing water in from Chestnut Hill and so on. They had all these other projects that were vital to the growth of the city. So this was, the Water Board was also, from a political point of view, one of these separate agencies, just like the fire wards had been, just like the House of Industry had been in the early days. There are always these independent charters in the state. So he was not under the city council. So even when Damrell would go and get a city council resolution passed to get a pipe laid somewhere or a hydrant somewhere, it could be very easily ignored, and was often ignored. And so it was in 1866 to 1871 that they still had this distribution of powers, and they had distribution powers as it affected the fire department. So there was one department and one committee that, for example, the Water Board, that determined where the pipes and where the hydrants would be. There was another department that determined where the fire engine houses would be. There was another department that controlled the budget for the fire department. But all these things that were individually very important for this, the functioning of a viable fire department were put in the hands of and distributed so that there was no one single person that had the power to get things done. So that's what Damrell was fighting, and of course, in a very well-known confrontation when he made up a plan for a very specific. Damrell had made up a plan for a very specific pipe project on Morton Place with a couple of hydrants, and gave the rationale and the cost justification for it and so on, and submitted it to the Water Board. The Water Board president, and we don't know whether it was Bradley or not. If we knew it was Bradley, we could have a really good conflict and we could make a big deal out of that. But it didn't matter because Bradley might not have said it in exactly this way, but the Water Board president sent back his clerk. He didn't actually go back himself, sent back his clerk, and he said, when we want the opinion of the chief fire engineer, we'll ask for it. And that was exactly how the chief fire engineer was treated by these quasi-independent agencies. So, as time went on, however, more cities began to burn down. And the next big fire was Chicago. So Chicago was, as you saw in that first slide, is about 10 times bigger in magnitude than Boston's, and it was a huge fire. It was 100,000 people were homeless, 300 people were killed, 10,000 buildings were burned down. There was probably more urban destruction in Chicago than in the Civil War. If you actually go out and add up the number of buildings that were burnt in Savannah and Atlanta and Richmond and Charleston, even though Charleston was burnt by civilian causes at one point. Well, adding all those Civil War, Chicago was worse. It was a complete disaster. And so Damrell was given the opportunity by his own committee of the fire department from the city council, and sent out to Chicago to find out what happened and learn what the lessons of Chicago are. So he talked with the fire marshal out there, Marshal Williams, and he also talked with General Sheridan, who was a Civil War cavalry hero, who had been in Chicago and was helping with the fire and also helping with maintain civil order after the fire. And what he learned was that it wasn't just one thing. It was very dry for a number of months before that. A lot of things were wooden in Chicago. The sidewalks were wood. There was a very stiff wind. The alarm was delayed. The fire engines were misdirected. They didn't have water in the places they needed it. And when they tried to use gunpowder, it didn't help. It didn't make any difference. It just blew down buildings, and the fire then burned more fiercely through the crumbled up building than the building that was intact. And this gunpowder was what he found out. He found out that from General Sheridan himself. And General Sheridan was sort of dubious. Damrell, even before this, was dubious about using gunpowder to stay a fire. But he asked General Sheridan, said, what we see in the Eastern newspapers is that the gunpowder was key to stopping the fire. And General Sheridan, that's completely false. It was of no help. If we'd had one more steam engine, it had been much more benefit than all the blasting we did. So Damrell returned to Boston and made a report and did all the things. He put the pressure on to get the water into this new district, the downtown district. He tried to get a firehouse in that district. He tried to get some teeth into the building code so they couldn't build these mansard roofs. Most of the destruction in downtown Chicago was from the mansard roofs that were built of wood, and it flamed from one to another. So in any case, he learned the lessons of Chicago. He came back and was once again just told to mind his own business, not to exaggerate the needs of his department so much. They were doing okay. And what happened over the next year, they had a nice jubilee, a peace jubilee, to celebrate the end of the Franco-Prussian War. That was the Peace Jubilee building. This is President Grant right here, coming to the Peace Jubilee. There was the fire department participated in that. They had 100 people banging on anvils to a Strauss waltz. I don't know exactly what tune. It must have been a very loud tune, though. And things were going on as normal. They had 600 alarms that year, 30 major fires. They were putting them out. The fire department was putting them out. So the people in City Hall were probably saying, this guy's always complaining, but he has enough. They did get him a few engines that year. And then came October of 1872. And, of course, these steam fire engines were very heavy. Some of these things were 6 tons. And they had to be pulled by these specially bred and well-trained horses. And exactly in the last half of October in 1872, there was an epizootic, which was an epidemic, a flu epidemic of the horses. It started in Canada, it came down, and virtually every horse in the United States, all the way down to Mexico and Panama, was affected sooner or later. It came through Boston at the end of October and the beginning of November, and every horse that was pulling a fire engine was sick, and it was debilitated. It couldn't pull. So Damrell met and made a special arrangement, hired 400 people, 400 volunteers to pull the engines. But it was, needless to say, for the long hauls from Roxbury and Dorchester, this wasn't an ideal situation. So, as time, first 2 weeks, about 12 alarms, put them out, things looked good, horses getting better. Then on November 9th, in the basement of this building right here, Tebbets, Baldwin, and Davis, on the corner of Kingston and Summer Street, there was a spark. No one knows where that spark came from, in the basement that ignited a fire. Now, the important things when a fire is ignited is that the alarm goes quickly, and that the fire engines get there quickly, of course. But for some reason, the fire built up to a tremendous intensity in the basement before anybody noticed. And the first time that anybody noticed was when the glass began to shatter out of the basement. So finally, the people crossed on Kingston Street, right here, heard the glass shatter, went down and saw this inferno, and then saw the fire shoot 6 stories right up to this mansard roof attic right up here. It's all wood, in a matter of seconds. Every floor was fully engaged within just a few minutes. So the entire structure was on fire. There was no alarm yet, because no one had, although people were going up and down the streets yelling fire, the alarm boxes themselves were boxes with keys in them. The policeman with the key had unfortunately just gone by on his beat and hadn't come back yet. So it was one of those coincidences. It was a late alarm. Well, of course, you know that they didn't have the horses there. It was in the district that there was very little water, and it was in the district where they had a lot of tall buildings with mansard roofs. So this is the map of the city, and you can sort of see the extent of the fire. Oops. Yeah, okay. So Damrell was at home on treatment on Temple Place, 60 Temple Place. He grabbed his hat and coat, came down, and when he got there on the ground of the fire, what he saw was this entire blazing building. And needless to say, it was so hot, as he said, he couldn't come within 50 or 60 feet of it. That was by his own testimony later on. Well, irrespective of how close he testified, he actually got in the front door, got an axeman to axe it down, put in assistant engineer Jacobs. Jacobs went up. This is a burning that people can't even get 50 to 100 feet within. And assistant engineer Jacobs is going through the front door with a hose and went up 2 flights of stairs. Damrell goes around to the back, right down here on Kingston, make sure that the other assistant engineers are in place and are fighting the back of the fire. He takes Nathan Brown, who had a hose down in the basement, and told him to get out of there. Just as he got Nathan Brown out, the building collapsed on the back and buried that alley. So Damrell saw what was going on. He went out front, got out assistant engineer Jacobs, got him out of that building, and then the building began to just completely shudder, convulse, and begin to come down. So one thing that he wanted to do was to contain the fire to that block. What happened, though, is impossible. The fire was so hot already, and it had already begun to start its own wind, and it was already becoming a firestorm. And although the wind was coming from the northwest at 6 miles an hour, soon the wind was burning the opposite direction. All the engines came down here in the south and stopped the fire from going very far here. But the fire in this firestorm started to go north. As soon as it crossed over to the corners of the other blocks, Damrell did several things. He told the companies from Charleston, the engine companies from Charleston, to get in to put themselves in Winthrop Square. The Cambridge were also in Devonshire and Otis Street. So he began to distribute them in the direction that the fire was coming. He also telegraphed to every town within 50 miles to bring their fire engines. The telegraph to the west was broken down, so he sent a train out to pick up all the fire engines that he could to bring all the possible help from virtually with every town within 50 miles, a 50-mile radius. And indeed, engines came from as far away as Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Hartford, Connecticut, and New Haven, Connecticut. So he already knew. He had already fought this fire many times in his mind because he had seen the danger and he knew that he would have to take, and it was that action right there that made possible what was to happen later on in the evening, the fact that they were fighting this firestorm. No one had ever even fought a firestorm, even let alone won against a firestorm. But he was not waiting 2 hours later. He was bringing in every available engine from New England right away, and that was very key. That having been said, between 8 and 10 p.m., the fire continued north into Winthrop Square. They got on the roofs of buildings, and they had batteries of engines all through Winthrop Square, up Devonshire and up Otis Street, but they couldn't stop the fire, and the reason they couldn't stop it was there wasn't enough water to put out the fire to begin with, and it was going like a crown fire in a forest. It was going from roof to roof. So all these mansard roofs were burning, and they were burning very fast. And if firemen got up on the roofs, they only had a few seconds before they had to get off the roofs because the fire was coming so fast over the wooden mansard roofs. So this was the scene in Winthrop Square. And it's sort of a scene the more you look at it. As you can see, there's a lot of steam engines in there. They have 5 or 6 steam engines. They have a lot of water. The fire is completely out of control, as is the crowd. So there's just, these aren't all firemen in this scene. Those are people. So that was one of the problems that they had to deal with all the time, was these crowds of people that were coming down to look at the fire. Some were trying to carry their goods away. Some of the times they were carrying goods away that were theirs, and sometimes they were carrying goods away that weren't theirs. So as the fire progressed, between 10 and 12, it is about 10 o'clock that Damrell decided that he needed to get a fresh view of what was going on, and he went to a place on Milk Street to take up to the 6th floor to take a look at it. And on the way, he had one of these moments that will also going to be appearing in the movie, I'm sure, is that he met a boy whose father and mother were trapped in a fire in the house, and he himself went into the house. He didn't give that job to someone else, but he went into the house up to the 2nd floor, couldn't go any further, never found the parents, but then had to come back out and give the boy to one of the neighbors as he went on to go to fight the fire. But it was one of those dramatic, and it says a lot about Damrell. It says that even though he had a lot of physical courage, it was more than just smart and understood how systems work and all this. He had a lot of physical courage, and he showed it there in that particular instance. What he saw when he got up on top of the building was a fire that was burning very, very fast. And there were some thieves. And he was called to City Hall. And at City Hall, there was enormous pressure put on him to use gunpowder. Now, he knew the gunpowder wouldn't work. He knew it wouldn't work. It didn't work in Chicago. He knew it didn't work in the 20 other places that had been tried. But as much to get back on the fire ground, and he authorized the use of gunpowder. The person who was leading the gunpowder oration and the force for gunpowder was General Burt right here, who is pictured right there. So General Burt and a group of other people from City Hall, city councilors and aldermen, separated in groups and went out and started to use gunpowder to stay the conflagration. So between 12 and 4 a.m., something, first of all, you can see the fire is spreading. It's down now to the harbor. Okay, it's going north to Fort Hill, Washington Square, and it's coming into Washington Street on the west. But to the south, they've held. So the fast response, putting the battery of engines there, the reasonably good supply from the hydrants right here, all meant that they could stop the fire going south. And they had one key battle, and that was at Hovey's right here, at this building on North Summer. So they stopped going west on Summer Street at this building, which, with some irony, was designed by Nathaniel J. Bradley. But it had the architectural feature that it was low in the back so they could cover it. The engines could cover it from low. And they did one other thing. They put blankets on the roof and wetted those blankets and sails and other kinds of cloth, and so that they kept the roofs from burning. And that was a critical part of the defense. So the people who were defending Hovey's after they got that done said, this is something we've got to do. We've got to expand this. And Damrell had already ordered a cadre of people up to Washington Street to do the exact same thing. So when the fire came into Washington Street, it had there was an opportunity to stop it. And it was stopped right here, right at Old South Church. And this is Old South Church. You can see the people with the blankets right there. They have the engines right here. This is the old transcript building. This is the Korean Trot building. You can see the mass of people down here. But this was the critical part and the turning point of the fire. And they stopped the fire right here in an Old South Meeting House. And there is a sort of a legend that grew up that there was an engine from Portsmouth, New Hampshire that came down, the Kearsarge that came in at the last moment, that was the key last hose teams and engine teams that saved Old South. So Kearsarge was always sort of given the credit for it, but as you can see, there's a lot of people at work here to keep Old South from burning down. Anticipating, no doubt, this lecture. So the trains were bringing in engines from all over. The Kearsarge came in from Portsmouth by train. They came in this one's from Worcester. And then they stopped. They stopped the fire. They had stopped at South by 4. They stopped at West by 6. And it still began to burn north. And the major reason it was burning north is that Bert was out there blowing up a lot of buildings. He's blowing up 30 or 40 buildings. And they had to take the firemen out of the way every time they blew up a building. They'd blow up a building, the fire would come through, and they weren't stopping the fire. So at the end of the fire, they had Damrell gave the order to stop the gunpowder, and they did. And this was the result. This is what the area to the west. This is from Summer Street, from Hovey's, and you can see the extent of the damage. It was a massive destruction. But it wasn't, and although it was bad, there were 776 buildings that were destroyed. There were 24 people that died. 12 were firemen died in the line of duty, and so it was 20,000 jobs were lost. It was a big loss, and it is very interesting, I think, and amazing that people don't know much about the Great Fire. So I'm going to wind this up right now, and we're going to play our reel. This was the event then that Damrell became a celebrity from this event. He was the fire chiefs that fought the fire with him endorsed everything he did. They around the country endorsed his type of fighting this fire and how he brought the steam engines in and his organization. And essentially he used that celebrity then to begin forming national connections. He founded the first national firefighting organization called the National Association of Fire Engineers. And it was through that agency then that he began to work to change building codes, to add fire safety. And when you see the movie, you'll see the other ways that he essentially then took that event, which was the Boston fire, this horrendous destructive fire, and turned that into an event that was transformed America and stopped America's cities from burning down. So we're going to just play the reel right here, and then we'll answer questions. Okay. Thank you. So if there's any questions, I have, yes. We're going to mic you here so that, because you're going to be on TV. I hope you're not in the Federal Witness Protection Program.
Yeah. This is sort of after the fire, and I don't know if you are covering that in your research, but clearly there must have been a lot of reconstruction. This must have entered into an enormous phase. And do you have?
Yeah. So what happened, and we didn't have time to cover that tonight. That you have to ask the question: why don't people know more about it? Well, one of the reasons people don't know more about it is because 90% of the buildings were rebuilt by 1874. They had a tremendous. They widened the streets a little bit. They cleared out Post Office Square. which William Burt had an intimate role in doing that in his own irrepressible way. And they rebuilt the city. And as a matter of fact, if you had gone on a European tour in October of 1872 to return in late 1874, you might not have. So why is the transcript building on the corner now instead of at the one end? It happened so fast, and I think that's one of the reasons that it's not as well known. It's not that well known. Chicago and other cities took much longer to rebuild.
I'm curious as to whether those mansard roofed buildings were of balloon construction and whether he was, as a contractor, was interested in stopping that form of construction when they rebuilt.
Yes, he was. He was interested in stopping that construction, but the codes that they passed in 1873 once again had no teeth in them. They made a few changes, but the fact is that the same bad type of construction happened. And I think this is one of the key reasons that Damrell later, we didn't get into his career afterwards, but after the fire, there was a commission. The commission made certain recommendations, and essentially endorsing all the suggestions that Damrell had made all the previous 6 years. At the end of the year, though, they did one of these political things where they got a new commission to be in charge of the fire department. Took it away from city council, just the way that they had done so many times before. And Damrell, rather than report to that commission, resigned. At the time he resigned, then, he had a decision of whether he was going to go back into business, stay in something in firefighting, go into politics and maybe even some scores, whatever. And he chose to go back into politics and became then the first building commissioner for the building inspector department. And then then everything changed. In Boston, things began to change. You can go to the public library and see these very thick volumes of occupancy permits, building permits, and then occupancy permits from that time. They begin in 1877, the time that he started as the building inspector, and went on. So there were ramifications to that, and he knew it was the problem, and he went after it, and stayed doing that his entire life.
I understand that there was a mismatch of the hose connectors on some of the fire engines that came from the outlying communities. Can you address the issue of standardization of hose sizes that may or may not have occurred as a result of the Boston fire? Well,
that's a very interesting topic, and of course the people coming in from out of town often didn't have the right size hose couplings. Not, of course, but they didn't. And we were interviewing one of the people for our movie, Ronnie Coleman, and he's the head. He was a former head of the NAFE, now called the International Association of Fire Chiefs. The organization that Damrell founded is still here today, and he was the president of it. And he said, "Well, that's one thing that still hasn't. They still haven't gotten that right." So apparently, within cities, there was standardization, but between cities, apparently there was not. Well, that's very interesting. But although the buildings burned down, needless to say, the land was still there, and the land lost no value. So the land was still there, and so it was taxable, and so that there was incentives. The state passed bills that allowed for rebuilding very fast. So they were very highly motivated because this was a commercial area. And there was, as we were saying, 20,000 jobs lost and 1,000 businesses. And some of these businesses were important businesses. It was 10% of the wool stock was in Boston when it burned down. So people were very inspired to get their businesses back on their feet. And so that the combination between the incentive, the financial incentive to do it, and also just the sheer capital that was in Boston at that time. I remember Isabel Stewart Gardner's husband, John Gardner. After the fire, the first thing he did, he was writing to his son and said, what we should do is we should form a fire insurance company now. We can do a lot of business right now. And that's sort of everybody's attitudes. It's okay, well, there were 20 companies that went bankrupt, but there was a lot of money around. And the money was, of course, from the China trade, from the Industrial Revolution. People owned a lot of railroads. So there was capital to do it, and they rebuilt very quickly.
Were the buildings mostly masonry, brick, or were there a lot of wooden buildings?
Well, I'll show you the percentage here. Oops, I'm out of control here. They're color-coded on this map if I ever get the map. I guess I won't get to the map until there. So if you can see that map, the gray are stone, the pink is brick, and in Boston, so the outside was granite, some other kind of stone, or brick, almost exclusively. Some sheds were behind that were wood. But as someone was saying, there was wood inside. There was balloon constructions inside. There was mansard roofs inside. So there was, although it looked pretty substantial from the outside, it was wooden to the core. Anybody else?
Box 52, the first box that came in on that?
Yes, it was.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, it was box 52, the box, and it was the first box. And as a matter of fact, it was a well-known bad box because in that was the area that they had the high buildings, the very tall buildings with the wooden roofs, and the lack of water. So there had been many bad fires, and it was this particular area and that box amongst a couple of others that Damrell actually put in his annual report, the first one that he did. But it was box 52, and of course box 52 was memorialized by the Box 52 Association for many years.
Could you talk a little bit about what changes in construction were implemented when they did this extensive rebuilding in order to prevent a similar tragedy?
So, as many of our expert witnesses, our expert contributors to the film, it often takes a major catastrophe to get things to change. The kinds of things that Damrell was going after, and he was going after them even before the fire, was to protect, in the first instance, the roof. So the mansard roof was not inherently a deficient roof. They had them in France. They were Second Empire architecture from Paris, and Paris wasn't burning down. As a matter of fact, it was just in the United States that the cities were burning down at the extreme regularity that you saw on that chart. So the first key issue was just to protect, not to have any exposed wooden surfaces on the roofs, and to build the walls between the buildings higher, and to add better protection on the roofs themselves. So they had a lot of discussion and investigation of what made the best roof and made it non-flammable. And so it's things of that nature, and that Damrell himself was a leader in getting fire safety. One of the things I didn't mention in that chart, that you didn't have a corresponding column. I showed the number of buildings, but I didn't show the number of people that died in each fire. Well, the reason that we didn't is because they didn't report them. No, people weren't that interested, I guess. It wasn't we'll get to the chart here. Fire prevention, there was no comparable data in the newspapers of the time of how many people died. In New York, in the first fire, just 2 people died, but in the second one, there was a couple hundred that died. So it varied widely. So Damrell was very sensitive to that issue, and so he was. The other kinds of things was that there were a lot of tenements being built, and even when he couldn't get something passed in the legislature, he would go on record in the newspaper, and we have several of these, him being quoted just saying, you can't build this open stairwell in the middle of a house and have that be the only way for people to get out. And so he was very sensitive to those specific issues of fire safety. And Boston actually led the nation in all these building codes in this, for fire safety and egress, and it was because of his work.
I know that Admiral Robert Byrd lived in Boston on the flat of Beacon Hill. By chance, was General Byrd his father?
No, it's actually Burt. It's B-U-R-T, and so it wasn't the same family at all. So, well, thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed it.